participants from such diverse fields, as well as diverse backgrounds, whether it be nationality or educational background or cultural background, as well as interdisciplinary interests. So all of these things, as have been repeatedly stated, make IAFOR conferences so special. I think we can learn a lot from each other, and certainly every time I come to an IAFOR conference, I learn new things. So I'd also like to thank our hosts, SOAS. I don't know if we have any speakers from SOAS, but as a British Asianist, who for my undergraduate work, I looked at sub-Saharan Africa. I know that's a controversial topic, but so is calling the School of Oriental and African Studies. But we move on. I've long wanted to visit SOAS and have never done so until 2 weeks ago. I had a conference here and now I'm back again. So it's interesting how things keep on bringing us back to where we started. So this presentation, do I have my presentation up here? Excellent. Thank you so much. So this presentation is based on an article I co-authored with one of my PhD students. Obviously, as was mentioned, my background is international relations, especially traditional and non-traditional security, which of course embraces the responsibility to protect, protection of civilians in armed conflict, refugee flows, forced migration, etc. But also, another of my interests, of course, is education, given my role at what was the largest women's university in the world, but we've just been overtaken by a university in Saudi Arabia. I know we have lots of Saudi Arabians in the audience, but we're still the second largest women's university in the world, and a very progressive university, so much so that they've appointed the first foreign dean in Korea, but also 138 years ago was set up to educate women in a very androcentric society. So I'm very well aware of the importance of education as a mechanism of empowerment. So that's what got me interested in working on refugee education. That and the fact that I was interviewing a lot of Rohingya refugees who are saying that they get lots of training programs provided for them by the United Nations and other organizations. They got training programs coming out of their ears, but what they really want is access to degree programs. Well, I know from my time in the university administration that if you don't have a valid national identification, there is no way you can join a university program. So how do we address the need for education of refugees, but also what are the rational self-interests of countries that could provide this education? So this presentation today, I'm also aware that we're already running behind time, so I may have to cut chunks of it, but it has been published in the Asian Political, Asia Pacific Social Science Review, published out of the Philippines, which is a Scopus ranked journal, very interdisciplinary as well, so I do recommend checking out that journal. It may even be open access, I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. But if you're particularly interested in what I'm talking about, speak to me afterwards and I will pass you my card and maybe I will illicitly pass you a copy of the actual publication. So it stems from an awareness of the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis, the global humanitarian crisis of refugees and forced migrants, but also this personal experience of discussion with refugees and what they want. So the global humanitarian crisis is among the most pressing challenges, not only to international governance, global governance, but also to the governance structures of domestic states. Obviously, there's a huge refugee crisis in Britain, which some would say resulted in Brexit, which is a whole other issue that I'm very upset about. But generally, we have an ongoing discourse at national governance and international governance level about what can we do about the problem of refugees and forced migrants. We have very little discussion about what we can do about the opportunity of refugees and forced migration. And I think this is where education really comes to the fore, that it's not just for those who are benefited by our benevolence. It's actually for the benefit of the societies to which people are moving. So securing higher education rights for refugees is critical not only for refugee self-empowerment, but also for the peaceful development of societies. Qualification recognition is the major barrier when refugees apply for work in their host countries. Many times it's because they're missing documentation, whether it be their national identification documentation. Of course, that's magnified when you're a stateless person, but also because they're either lost or destroyed as you leave the oppressive conditions that force you to leave. But also it's in terms of their education documents, that they can't prove the level they've already attained when it comes to education. So this issue led to the 2019 Global Convention on Refugee Education, the first global treaty on higher education. So since 2019, we've been aware of the problem, at least since 2019, but we're still faced with major challenges and obstacles. So the research that this presentation is based on focused on the most positive national governance provisions when it comes to refugee education. These are Canada, Norway, Australia, and also, strangely, South Korea. I say strangely because South Korea is not famous for being very accepting of refugees at all. In fact, I think it's the lowest refugee acceptance rate in the OECD, about half of that in Japan, which is the second lowest in the OECD. But what South Korea does very well is accept North Korean refugees. They just don't call them refugees. So they've got a lot of educational policies in place for North Korean refugees that if South Korea was ever to open its doors properly to refugees under its international commitments, it would have a good foundation upon which to build. So it's noticeable that these four countries are identified as, and certainly self-identify as, middle powers. And what are middle powers? Well, middle powers are sort of middling powers. They're not great powers, but they're not small powers. They can be system-affecting states. And what they tend to do is identify niches of foreign policy where they can have the greatest bang for their buck, or one in the case of Korea. And often this niche diplomacy is in the area of humanitarian governance issues. They look to contribute to global governance reform, not only because it's the right thing to do, normatively, but because from their own perspective, their own self-interest of niche diplomacy, they get more bang for their buck. So global governance reform represents a noble opportunity for middle powers not only to aid the most vulnerable individuals and groups, but also to raise their own prestige and influence on the international stage. So that's what I'm going to be looking at today. I'm probably going to cut reference to Norway, Australia, and Canada in the interest of timekeeping. But certainly I'll talk quite a bit about South Korea's policy. Nope. What have I done wrong? Press the wrong button. Ah, there we go. That helps. Okay, good. So, global humanitarian crisis. Well, we can't even agree on how bad the global humanitarian crisis is. Certainly it poses a severe challenge. The number of forcibly displaced people worldwide is estimated at somewhere between 110 million or 135 million, depending on the sources of the statistics. So it's a severe challenge to national governments and to international organizations. Along with the climate crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and the conflict in Israel-Palestine, it's one of the most serious challenges to the oft-quoted liberal rules-based international order. Unlike these other challenges, however, the humanitarian crisis is distinguished by a much greater capacity for action by small and middle powers. That we can all do something at the national level, at the local level, to address the challenges faced by refugees and forced migrants. So the forcibly displaced figures include refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people, and other people in need of international protection. Of these numbers, about 35.5 million are recognized as refugees. And these numbers have overwhelmed the existing systems and resources of international organizations and, of course, hosting countries. And it's very easy for rich countries to point the finger of blame, but the burden, such burden as it is, of refugees falls overwhelmingly on neighboring developing countries, not on the rich countries, even the rich countries that have taken the most refugees. So the international rules-based order has paid significant attention to these vulnerable individuals and groups. But while much attention has been paid to crisis relief, the immediate humanitarian protection of the forcibly displaced, this is only a short-term fix. And indeed, how long can we keep people in refugee camps? How long can we exclude them from being empowered individuals that can contribute to society? So much of it does not focus on the long-term needs of refugees, especially in terms of education. And this is what I mentioned before. They have lots of training programs, but they don't have access to tertiary education. In the field of education, in terms of the liberal rules-based order, the focus has been on securing international recognition of the right to primary and, to a lesser extent, secondary education. And we see this in the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. But very little attention paid to the right to tertiary education. Yet, I think it's tertiary education where we have an area of greatest potential contributions, the greatest impact of middle powers, the greatest generation of the collective good. So if we look at refugee protection, refugees are guaranteed special protection as vulnerable groups under international humanitarian law. The 1951 Refugee Convention provided a legal framework for the protection of displaced people in Europe after World War II. In 1967, we have the Protocol relating to the status of refugees, which added without any geographic limitation, thereby removing the temporal and geographic limitations of the initial Refugee Convention. Critics of the existing normative regime point to the relative lack of documentation of international responsibility sharing. So you have all these rights held by refugees, but it's not clear who has the responsibility to make sure refugees can enjoy these rights. Likewise, we can have all these rights to education in the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, but who has the responsibility to provide access to this education? To address this gap, the General Assembly unanimously adopted the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migration in 2016. And this consensus reaffirmed the member states' commitment to sharing responsibilities concerning the global refugee crisis. So you're not going to say it's all Bangladesh's responsibility because that's where most of the Rohingya have ended up. That officially, everyone is supposed to share responsibility for this. 2018, the UN General Assembly adopts the Global Compact on Refugees as a framework for enhancing equitable responsibility sharing. And the key objectives were to alleviate pressure on host countries, to reinforce refugee self-reliance, to expand access to third country solutions, and to support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity. Of course, the second of these goals, reinforce refugee self-reliance, how do we do that? We do that through education. Related conceptualizations of global obligations can be found not only in the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, but also in the concept of the responsibility to protect. That everyone acknowledges it's everybody's responsibility. That no government or no system of governance is exempt from responsibility. Now, when it comes to refugee education, around 41% of refugees are under the age of 18. They're deprived of basic human rights, including the access to education, and in particular, access to tertiary education, essential for knowledge and capacity building. Since 2012, the UNHCR has initiated strategies for refugee children and youths to promote their education enrollment at all levels. The Education Strategy 2012 to 2016 aimed to support the UNHCR's emphasis on access to quality education for refugees. Tertiary schooling increased from 1% to 3%. So 300% increase, but we're still only up to 3%. So far short of the global average for tertiary education, which is 37%. And far below the rates for primary and secondary education. Primary and secondary education is accepted as a universal right for all boys and girls. Higher education is seen more as a privilege or luxury. This is despite educational research demonstrating higher education not only reinforces individual competence, but also helps sustainable development of a society. Higher education is critical for refugees to overcome the challenges of post-conflict reconstruction, poverty reduction, transformation from financial and social dependence to self-reliant contributors to society. Educated refugees empower their communities. They promote social, economic, and gender equality. Again, therefore, there's a happy coincidence, I would argue, of policies aimed at benefiting vulnerable individuals and groups also serving national interests. With access to higher education critical not only for self-empowerment, but also the peaceful development of societies. So in 2019, the UNHCR announced Refugee Education 2030, a strategy for refugee inclusion to ensure access to inclusive and equitable quality education for refugees in national systems. Unfortunately, this also hasn't fixed all the problems. Refugees face financial constraints, scarcity of institutions, linguistic barriers. But perhaps the biggest challenge is what I've already talked about, the problem of documentation. Documents can be lost or stolen, or they cannot be issued from countries of origin due to destruction or closure by conflict. These challenges were, of course, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. To mitigate the discrepancy between goals and realities, UNESCO endorsed the Global Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications Concerning Higher Education in 2019. You'll notice the titles get longer and longer and longer as they try to be more inclusive. And this includes the right to have foreign qualifications assessed in a fair, non-discriminatory and transparent manner, recognition which must be given unless the recognizing authority can demonstrate substantial differences. So in other words, the burden of proof shifts from the refugee to the recognizing authority, and it's up to them to prove that the qualifications of the refugee are not sufficient to meet the standards of the host country. And thirdly, procedures for the recognition of qualifications for individuals with insufficient or unverifiable documentation, including refugees and displaced persons. So here we see the evolution of global responsibilities to provide access to education for refugees. In the Asia-Pacific region, in 2011, we had the Asia-Pacific Regional Convention on Recognition of Qualifications in Higher Education, shorthand the Tokyo Convention, which emphasizes higher education achievements of refugees, displaced persons, and persons in refugee-like situations, which should be recognized as widely as possible unless there are substantial national differences. As I previously mentioned, Australia, Canada, and Norway are among those who have accepted the largest number of refugees. South Korea, very low acceptance rate, but what they have in common is they have this self-identification as being middle powers, almost secular saints, that we gain substantial benefit from demonstrating what wonderful people we are, what wonderful governments we are. So South Korea, if it wants to join this club of secular saints, needs to abide by the same sort of regulations and have the similar sort of aspirations to these Western middle powers. And I think they have significant comparative advantages as well, because they're not a Western middle power. So they may be more acceptable in terms of providing assistance to others. But South Korea thus far has limited itself to North Korean refugees. I'm not going to go through the benchmarking of the three Western middle powers. I'm going to skip straight to South Korea's education recognition policy for North Korean refugees, because I think we have a lot that we can learn from South Korea in this. Since 1997, North Korean refugees have had legal right to education in South Korea. Furthermore, educational attainments of North Korean refugees in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and in other countries are legally recognized in South Korea. Despite this legal protection, there are, of course, still some structural barriers to the fulfillment and efficient implementation of policies related to refugee education. Before its revision in 2009, the provisions for North Korean refugees were somewhat limited. There are limitations for North Korean refugees to continue studying in accordance with the Education Act of 2009. Refugees, especially the youth, could miss out on years of education during their arduous journeys, often through China, through a third country, before they even get to South Korea. Students often, therefore, had to study in grades lower than their age groups, which, of course, is damaging to their self-esteem as well as to their integration. This led to a higher dropout rate amongst North Korean refugees than their South Korean counterparts. Differences between educational systems of the two Koreas make it difficult to determine educational qualifications. So amendments were made to the Act, the 2009 Act. And these amendments were supposed to address these shortcomings. So we had the establishment and operation of academic background deliberative committees. Fortunately, that can be abbreviated to ABDCs, so close. As of 2008, ABDCs began to hold meetings in the 16 metropolitan and provincial offices of education in Korea, and the most notable change is that recognizing diplomas obtained in North Korea allows a refugee to receive the equivalent qualification in South Korea. So it certainly made it easier for North Koreans to adapt to South Korea, to have their qualifications recognized, for them to contribute to South Korean society. There are still a few issues and limitations. Academic placement based on achievements in North Korea does not equate perfectly with academic abilities and knowledge. The dropout rate of North Korean college students is still higher than their South Korean counterparts. And information about North Korean refugees is not shared among the different offices. So we don't have a consistent national policy. It's administered by the 16 metropolitan and provincial offices of education. So it means that applicants can abuse the system by applying to different educational offices to see what the best deal they can get. So where do we go from here? Due to their relative wealth and liberal epistemological traditions, Western middle power states have often been a magnet for refugees. Superficially, at least when compared to other states, Western middle powers have been relatively welcoming of refugees and facilitative in recognition of their qualifications. Norway has been at the forefront of the European system of refugee qualification recognition. Norway was the first to ratify the Global Convention, reaffirming a commitment to fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory recognition. Canada and Australia have, historically, been welcoming and have served as good global citizens. Unfortunately, due to the current refugee crisis, regulations have been tightened in both Canada and Australia. Canada and Australia are also decentralized in their policy response, even more so than Korea. It's often difficult for refugees to access the relevant information for qualification recognition. They're sometimes unable to obtain the required documents, or their documents are not recognized. The challenges faced in Australia and Canada are, of course, also reflected in South Korea by those few refugees not of North Korean extraction who make it to the country. Many of the refugees in the Asia Pacific are essentially stateless, either because they have lost or discarded their documentation during their flight, or, as is the case with the Rohingya refugees, because no state recognizes them as citizens. In 2018, the UNHCR warned there are about 12 million stateless people in the world. A large portion of those are the Rohingya. For Korea, a centrally headquartered and administrated policy-making procedure would be better able to acknowledge the distinctive difficulties the refugees face regarding qualification recognition and access to higher education. Specific processes can refer to the existing policy framework for North Korean refugees, but we can expand it for consideration of other refugees. And I think that Korea has a huge amount to gain by taking this initiative. It can gain for normative and national interest reasons. Normatively, because they can say, look, we're at the forefront in the Asia Pacific of being secular saints, of being international do-gooders. But for national interest reasons, well, South Korea faces a demographic time bomb. They already have the lowest population replacement rate in the world. So they're going to have to accept more people. It's not a question of they want to or not, they have to. So they can make a virtue out of this necessity. And thereby, they can play a major role in the reformulation of the liberal rules-based order, which is apparently the aspiration of the current Korean administration, or at least the president. We recently also had elections in South Korea, and the opposition have been returned to the assembly So the president may be something of a lame duck now. But certainly I think that there's more discussion along these lines, and it's particularly important in Korea, where they spend more on education per capita than any other country in the world. It's the most educated workforce in the world, probably the most over-educated workforce. I think we have something like 80% go on to tertiary education. We have the highest number of PhDs, probably the highest number of unemployed PhDs as well, because what we really need is people to fill the other jobs now. So why not accept far more refugees and far more migrants? So on that note, I think I'll hand over to you guys for questions.
Thank you very much, Brendan. We have time for one question. One question, but then Professor Howe will be about who wants that one question. There we go. Straight in there early. Please wait for the microphone.
Thank you very, very, very much that you enlightening the problem of the education of refugees. But I think you miss important things concerning Middle East. Mm-hmm. In the Middle East, we have a serious, very serious challenge and problems. For example, people in Sudan, people in Sahara, people in Libya, people in Syria. We have stress in Egypt. We have about 9 million refugees in Egypt, children between 6 years old until 20 years old. They don't have any document. They don't have any certificate. They need help. Egyptian government cannot help. United Nations they have a lot of problems to give help. What do you think about that? How to do that?
Thank you very much for that question. I may not have specifically mentioned the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa or any of the other regions where we see these problems, but importantly, it is a global problem. And also importantly, it's a global responsibility to address it, which is what the UN has been trying to do with these documents, saying that it's not just the responsibility of those countries that have to accept all the refugees because they're neighboring countries. It's everybody's responsibility, and we should be focusing on burden sharing. The problem is that even if the UN says this, national governments don't do it. So what I'm looking at is how can we encourage national governments to do what it says on the can, to put their money where their mouth is. And I think it's precisely through this normative process of naming and shaming, saying, look, you claim to be champions of the liberal international rules-based society. The rules say this. Let's see you live up to those expectations. And amongst the powers that might have the best incentive to do so are middle powers, because they don't have the military or economic capacity to coerce others to achieve their preeminence. All they can do is focus in niche areas that can raise their profile and have others look to them as a good global citizen. So I think this is why we need to look at not only the traditional European middle powers, but also non-European middle powers, or as I like to call them now, second-tier powers, because a lot of them have greater resources than mere middling resources. They can actually do more, and they should do more. I hope that answers it.
Thank you very much.